series of webinars. First in a series of webinars organized by UNESCO, UNICEF, and the World Bank, which is part of their effort to support national governments in their preparation and implementation of the reopening of schools. This is one of several examples of collaborations of multilateral agencies through the Global Education Coalition in responding to COVID-19. In April, a very valuable reference, the Framework for Reopening of Schools, was issued by UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Bank, and the World Food Programme. This framework serves to inform the decision-making process by guiding you through a set of questions. Why to reopen schools? When, where, in which schools to reopen, and how to reopen schools. Of course, it's necessary to contextualize and continuously adapt in response to local conditions and to meet each child's learning, health, and safety needs. Therefore, this webinar series aims to share experiences, lessons, and expertise on strategies for reopening schools. Each of the 5 webinars focus on a different dimension or theme for reopening schools. Our focus today is on learning, and our moderator, Hugues Moussi, will introduce the webinar in a moment. But let me just tell you that subsequent webinars will focus on safe school operations. That will be later this week on June 10th. Well-being, which will be next week on June 15th. And then followed by reaching the most marginalized and high-stakes exams. We hope you will be able to join us for each one in this series. I now have the pleasure to turn over to our moderator for today, Mr. Hugues Moussi. Hugues?
Thank you, Sue. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so very much for this introduction to the series of webinars. Good afternoon, good morning, and also good evening, depending on where you are, and welcome to this webinar that will focus on learning in the COVID-19 era. My name, as Sue Grant-Levis just said, is Hugues Moussi. I'm the head of research and development at UNESCO-IAP. The topic, as you can see, learning in the COVID-19 era is vast and could justify in itself a whole series of webinars. We will focus during the discussion on 3 sub-themes. First of all, the evaluation assessment of learning and teaching experiences that took place during the crisis. What approaches have been or are still being, in a lot of cases, used to gauge the teaching and learning experience during the crisis. This crisis, and how does these articulate with school reopening strategies? Secondly, remedial actions and accelerated learning programs. So here, what needs to be adjusted with regard to curricula, timetables, instructional time? What remedial programs are or will be put in place to bridge the learning gap when school reopen? And third, how are teachers prepared to school reopening? What kind of supports do they need and get? This will also extend to all education personnel at large. For all of these questions or sub-questions, the key issue of vulnerable and disadvantaged students will be highlighted and taken into consideration. So as you can see, this is still a broad range of questions. To discuss them, we invited 5 panelists from different organizations and regions of the world. They will provide their input based on their work, background, the work they do currently on the COVID-19 crisis, and also through the lens of the region and country they work in and with. So to begin with, let me introduce them first. I have to apologize because I put my camera on, but I don't think that I'm online, and I'm not sure why. So I'm going to continue anyway. So let me introduce our panelists. First of all, Jane Courtney. Jane is an education specialist at UNICEF based in Jordan, where she's now currently designing programs to promote children's learning recovery during and post-COVID-19. Thanks, Jane, for joining. David Steiner is the Executive Director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy and Professor of Education at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks again. I don't put the whole biography of all our panelists that you can find on our concept note. Rukmini Banerji is the CEO of Pratham, and she's, as you know, internationally recognized as both a champion and expert of foundational learning. Tara Bettel is a senior economist in the East Asia Pacific region and leads the World Bank's Teacher Careers and Professional Development thematic group. And finally, my colleague Guangchol Chong is the Chief of Section of Education Policy in the Division of Policies and Lifelong Learning System at UNESCO, based in Paris. So to all of you, thank you for having accepted to participate in the webinar and to be online now. Just a word on how it's going to unfold. There won't be any presentations as such during the webinar, but rather a series of questions posed to our panelists. So I will first, during the next 45 to 50 minutes, lead the discussion with them. And then afterwards, we'll have a Q&A session with the audience. So please now begin to pose your questions on the chat online, and we will at the end relay them to our panelists and try to leave as much time as we can to do so, to engage with the audience. To begin with and engage on this vast program, let me first ask a question to my colleague, Guangchol from UNESCO Paris. So most recently, UNESCO, together with UNICEF and World Bank, jointly conducted a survey to assess government's education responses to ensure schools are prepared for reopening. Can you provide some information, GC, about the major trends in reopening schools, as well as lessons or takeaways that can be drawn from UNESCO's monitoring exercises? Guangchol?
Okay, thank you. Indeed, UNESCO has been monitoring national responses to COVID-19 since its outbreak, including a series of surveys with countries. The most recent survey, jointly conducted with UNICEF and World Bank, was in May, with responses from 99 countries. Here, I'd like to present a couple of slides to share some preliminary results on aspects related to pedagogical continuity when schools reopen. As you can see in the slide, in around 7% of countries, schools were already reopened. Another 45% of countries are planning to reopen schools nationwide, while 1 in 4 countries are planning to reopen schools gradually by region where sanitary situations have improved, and 1 in 5 countries are planning to reopen in a phased manner by grade or age group. This means that some 95% of countries have already reopened or intending to reopen schools as soon as the conditions permit, which is in contrast with the situation in April, where only around 50% of countries were anticipating or planning to reopen their education institutions. To the question on how governments are planning to organize learning continuity and curriculum transition when school reopen, 63% and 35% of countries were planning to introduce remedial learning and accelerated learning programs respectively. More than half of countries were preparing a plan to adjust the scope of learning contents to be covered this year. And 15% of countries indicated they plan to increase class time. Furthermore, 1 in 3 countries anticipated that the next school year calendar could be affected. This slide shows that the majority of countries have postponed or rescheduled the date of the exams. And if we add countries that canceled the exams, the proportion of countries that postponed or canceled exams amount to around 60%. Other countries maintained exams as planned or with some delay by organizing online exams, reducing curriculum content to be assessed, or introducing alternative assessment and validation of learning, as we can see on this slide. So what we have learned from the analysis of survey responses are many. Some main findings are that first, most countries are planning to organize remedial learning programs to support students that may have fallen behind in their learning, and also to support preparation for national examinations. Second, the level and scope of the catch-up programs will depend on learners' specific needs based on assessment of learning experiences and effectiveness of the distance learning programs, especially for most disadvantaged students who require extra support and guidance. Third, many countries are aiming to reduce the curriculum content taught this year in order not to overload and further stress students that require support, not only academically, but also on their psychosocial and well-being needs. Fourth, countries plan to deploy remedial or accelerated learning programs through various strategies, such as leveraging the potential of blended learning through a mixture of distance and skill-based learning programs, organizing catch-up lessons during school vacation periods, or adjusting the next school year with additional lessons to cover the content that would have been insufficiently covered during the current period. So this is the snapshot of the main findings of the surveys in respect of the school reopening and curriculum continuity. And for more guidance on pedagogical continuity when schools reopen, UNESCO has developed an issue note just last day, over the weekend. We'll provide the web link in the chat room. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Guangchol. I think the results of this survey really sets the ground for our discussion, where we see globally the situation of countries as regard reopening schools, and also the variety of responses in terms of resuming learning and articulating what has happened during the crisis when schools were closed, with strategies to reopen. I would like now with our other panelists to dig more into different situations, whether thematic situation or also based on regional or national examples. Rukmini, I will turn to you now, and I think we'll go directly to the core of the question of learning. Studies on the impact of school closures on learning suggest that significant learning loss has been and is inevitable. Given that for many children and students around the world, basic levels of reading and arithmetic too, numeracy were already at low levels even before the COVID-19 crisis, and especially when it comes to marginalized student groups, what do you think should be done as schools reopen, if we articulate in a way the COVID crisis with the precedent learning crisis? Rukmini, the floor is yours now.
Thank you so much. I'd like to just start by saying that perhaps this year, when the schools open, whenever they open, is probably the most anticipated school opening in our memory. And I think parents are waiting, teachers are waiting, and above all, children are waiting to go back to school. And when people start going back to school, it'll actually announce in the community that it's okay to return to our routine, at least some kind of a routine. And so I think that this opportunity has to be really celebrated and made the most of. A second thing before going to learning that I feel has happened in this period, at least we feel that in India during the lockdown, is that parents who were otherwise perhaps not at the center of what was going on have come to the center because any educational or learning or even engagement activity that has happened in this period has been really with the help of parents and siblings. So I think that the second thing we should celebrate and recognize when schools open is that parents have played a big role. And at least in my country, where many parents are not very well educated, they are sometimes not seen as, I think, in their full potential as the assets that can be. So as schools open, I think it's very important to give children and teachers and parents the opportunity to come back and to reconnect. And in that reconnecting, I think there is children need to reconnect with their friends and teachers need to reconnect with their students. And during this period, I think it would be a very good idea to take a quick look and a very one-on-one look at where the children are. We need to meet the children at the level at which they are. So whether it is simple reading or simple math that we knew that in many of our countries, children are already at a low level, it's important to find out where they are. And of course, from our experience in Pratham and in India of having done the ASR kinds of surveys, for those of you who are not familiar, the very, very simple, quick reading and a quick math assessment that just is done one-on-one, in which I feel that the teachers or even in the community, we could take a look at where our kids are and then immediately begin to try to help them. Now, many countries will be in a rush to say, how can we go back to our curriculum? How can we go back to our content? Maybe schools are already opening a couple of months late. My view is that let's take our time. This has been a difficult time for families, for children, for teachers, and let's take our time to help everybody settle back in. And during this time, give as much room as possible for rebuilding these foundational skills. How can we get back to reading? Let's start at the level at which the child is at, not necessarily at his grade level or her grade level, and let's help them move forward. In Pratham, we use an approach called teaching at the right level. It's been used quite a lot in India and now is being used in Africa. And we see that even with an hour put aside every day for reading, an hour for basic arithmetic, figuring out where the children are at, grouping at them at the right level, and using a bunch of simple activities can help them make progress quite quickly, especially if they are in grades 3, 4, 5 or above. And I think that this is the year in which we should take the time, which actually, even in normal years we need to do, but perhaps this year it's even more important, allow the time for reconnecting, allow the time for catch up, and give a room both to parents and to teachers to help the children get back to where they were. And so I think that what we can do inside the school, of course, is very important. But I think parents have shown that they can be big participants in this process. So simple, for example, we were just talking the other day among our colleagues that what about a story a day that can even be broadcast from temples or mosques or other places in the community, which helps everybody get together to say, our children may have missed a couple of months, but we are not going to let them fall behind. And as a system, as an education system, we need some quick feeling of progress. And like, when you ride a bike or you learn to swim, it's suddenly very visible that you're moving ahead. I think reading is like that. And so I'm hoping that this, push towards really building our children's foundational skills everywhere can happen in this year. Our government in India has announced a foundational literacy and numeracy mission, which will be launched later in the year. But I think that we can already start to say that our kids may have missed a few steps, but this is the year in which we are going to really make sure that their foundations are fine.
Thank you very much, Rukmini. I think it's very not only strong but sensitive message around time for catch-up. Take time to catch up from, friend to friend, students, students to teachers, parents with the school system, and so on. I think it is very important because families, parents, teachers, students have been through a difficult time also that has to be recognized. And of course, what you do at Pratham, teaching at the right level, which has really is famous now all over the world. These, I don't know how to call it, an approach or a method, a strategy maybe, which is also so important and really rings a bell even more, I think, now that everybody in class will have to see where we are and where we stand. And I also really think it is important, as you were saying, to have this quick feeling of progress, not only resuming, trying to see who is lagging behind and what's the gap, to resume this feeling of progress. So that's, I think, very important. Probably we'll have to go along the discussion. You put a focus on what happened in India, which is, of course, a major and huge country. And this is a lens. I would like with Tara maybe to take another lens that might be less national, more in terms of, international organizations. Tara, you're working at the World Bank, as I was saying. Could you tell us what the World Bank is doing and has been doing to support more particularly teacher effectiveness during the crisis, the COVID-19 crisis? And how can these strategies that you developed to support teacher effectiveness be and activities, how can they be articulated with the question of school reopening now?
Sure, thanks for that question. So as school systems begin to open, and we heard from Gong Choi that almost 7% of them are starting to open, teachers are likely to face at least three kinds of challenges. The first is just that it's going to be quite stressful. It's likely to be stressful just because of the uncertainty associated with what the future holds, anxiety about their own health, the health of loved ones. The second is that they are going to be returning to schools where there's this expectation that teachers have to bring students back to grade level, and a lot of pressure on teachers without a lot of support on how to do it. And the third challenge that teachers are likely to face is that they actually have very little access to the right skills to be able to do all of this. And with these three challenges in mind, the World Bank proposed a note which identifies 3 key principles, which it feels is very important as schools begin to open to support teachers and teacher effectiveness. So these 3 principles are, the first is to support teacher resilience to ensure teacher effectiveness. The second is to support teachers instructionally to ensure teacher effectiveness. And the third is to support teachers technologically to ensure teacher effectiveness. So 3 key things: resilience, instruction, and technology. And I'm going to go through these 3 principles quite quickly, give a little bit more detail on them. And the way I want to look at each principle is in terms of how can we support teachers when schools are closed as well as when they're about to open. That's one part. And the second part is what can we do in terms of long-term improvement of the system? How can we use this as an opportunity to improve things? So with the first, which is to support teacher resilience to ensure teacher effectiveness, the first part of this is to ensure that teacher jobs and salaries are protected. And I think this is a concern across several countries, what's going to happen with salaries. And this is so important because unless we have a motivated workforce to welcome students back, it's going to be really hard. And let's not forget that many of these teachers must be under a lot of financial duress. Some of them may be the only earning members of their families. A lot of jobs have gone. So to be able to ensure that they have their salaries and they have their salaries on time, that's really important. Second is to enhance teacher intrinsic motivation by trying to build professional prestige of teachers. Teachers can play a really important role while schools are closed. One of the ways in which it was just suggested by Rukmini, you could have them tell stories, you can have ways in which teachers are looked up to, bring the community together. And the third is to limit teacher burnout. Some strategies that we've been seeing work are, for instance, structured peer support groups amongst teachers. These aren't expensive. There's a very promising example from the DRC where it seems to improve teacher emotional health and well-being. There's interesting work being done in Mexico, which uses sort of the latest findings in neuroscience to help teachers cope with stress. So this is one set of things that I think we should be able to do to support teacher effectiveness. And then in terms of what can be done in the long term, because teaching is a pretty difficult, demanding, stressful job, countries should try now to begin investing in specialized counseling units for teachers. Many schools have this for students, but there isn't a lot for teachers. And of course, empowering teachers with knowledge on what to do when similar emergencies or crises happen. I think teachers were caught completely unaware with very little guidance, but how can we prepare them for things in the future? The second principle is to support teachers instructionally to ensure teacher effectiveness. And here again, there are three main things. The first is, of course, to equip teachers to build psychosocial resilience, not just amongst themselves, but also amongst their students. We talked a little bit about this earlier, so I won't go in there. The second is to equip teachers to assess students. So when students return, teachers will need to know how many of them are where in terms of key foundational skills. And it's tricky because they have to do this in a very delicate, sensitive manner so that no child really feels like they're being made to look bad. So some support for teachers and how to do this well. Again, Rukmini spoke a little to that. And once you've equipped students, once you've equipped teachers on assessing student skills, then the next step, which is to be able to equip teachers for effective remedial education to expedite this kind of recovery. And again, we have an excellent example with the teaching at the right level. It's proven effective in South Asia, India, and it's being adopted by countries in Africa. And Botswana, for example, provides a good example. It helps us understand how to group students and then provide them with specialized help so that whoever needs a particular kind of help can get that in good time. And it's all done in a relatively low stress environment, which is what's important. And then in the next phase, which is the phase where you can, reform and improve the system, what can one do to improve instructional ability of teachers? So a few things that this note brings out. One is to sort of emergency-proof the pre-service teacher education curriculum. Teacher education curricula that at least I am familiar with across countries has very little on technology. Teachers aren't really taught how to use or what to do with technology. So that's something that really should be fixed. When Hong Kong experienced the SARS epidemic in 2003, that's one of the immediate things they started doing, which was working on revamping the pre-service teacher curriculum to make it very technologically savvy. The second is to reform in-service teacher training and make it much more flexible, short, blended, and useful to teachers. So it comes in and provides teachers exactly the kind of help they need, isn't too long. If it's in a poor resource area, then one could think of radio solutions, interactive radio, where teachers can call up a number or join a WhatsApp group. But the interactive part is really important. And the third is to, again, have these kinds of build just-in-time mechanisms for teachers. In most countries, teachers receive just a few hours or a few days of, and that's about it. They have no other recourse to help. But instead, if they could have this kind of help shortly before they had to teach something. So ways of revamping the system to look at that. And the third principle is to support teachers technologically to ensure teacher effectiveness. And this means we have to provide teachers access to broadcast and digital communications. For instance, when schools closed, then some school systems, such as the Kyrgyz Republic, provided all their teachers with SIM cards so that they could access online material. And it's one thing to give them that technology. It's another thing to also help them use it effectively. So again, there are countries which started training teachers quite early on, like in Lebanon. Teachers were trained in how to use Microsoft Teams to upload material. And the third is, of course, to encourage frequent use of technology by teachers. And in the long term, one can see teachers just being encouraged to use technology more, even if it's for simple things like resolving HR-related issues, or more complex things such as connecting technological tools to learning goals and filling gaps in mastery. So in short, these are the three principles that we think can really help teachers be effective as they manage the crisis and later on. So supporting teacher resilience, supporting teachers instructionally, and supporting teachers technologically. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara. It's really interesting and very also, I think, exhaustive in terms of how you can, or how countries can support teachers. Beyond the three principles that you highlighted, I see two very interesting things which I think we could also continue to discuss. The first one, which Rukmini also pointed out, is kind of the balance between sensitivity and the human aspect of returning to school. What is engaged in the relationship between teachers and students? You said at some point that you need to assess, the learning loss in a sensitive manner, but also efficiency, effective remedial education. So there is this balance, I think, which everybody feels is important. The second thing too, which is core to the overall topic that we have, learning in the COVID-19 era, but in regards to the framework of school reopening, is how the short-term responses also need to be articulated with the long-term strengthening or development or reinventing sometimes, why not, of education systems. And I think it's really very key for that. Let's continue to dig into this question of teachers. And David, I will turn to you now to continue on this conversation. And you will speak from a country that has been one of the epicenters of the crisis for the past week with a few others. How do you think should teachers best address what will not only be, some moral slide in skills and knowledge, but also the fact that their least privileged students will be even further behind? David?
Thank you so much. Yes, we estimate here in the United States that underprivileged children will, as so often tragically, be the most impacted and may lose some 40% in mathematics, for example, of the learning we might have expected to occur without COVID. This is doubly challenging because the least privileged communities often have the least access to internet, to the hardware and software they require to access learning. Here in Baltimore, a very underprivileged city in the United States, we have had to hand out reading packets because many, many children are in that situation. So the first, I think, critical challenge is that teachers may face a very mixed population in many places where some children simply don't have access to online learning and the teachers are going to have to be supported in multiple modalities of instruction. That's the first point. The second point is that when children come back to school, the least advantaged will be even further behind, and teachers will be encouraged to meet them where they are, as Rukmini said. The challenge, however, is not to leave them where they are. The challenge is to identify a few crucial learning skills and knowledge in math, in language, in the sciences, and to accelerate learning for all underprivileged groups so that they have access to these simplified, crucial grade level skills. Otherwise, what will happen is we will bake that disadvantage, that extra slide in learning, into their lives, and they will never catch up. We have a lot of research here in the United States that traditional remediation doesn't work effectively. Yes, out of good conscience, teachers meet students where they are, but they never bring them back up. The third issue goes to diagnostics. How do we know what the slide in learning is? The United States has end-of-year assessments that are at this point going to be rightly abandoned for this year. Can they be brought back in the fall so that teachers get some sense of the learning slide? Even better, can teachers use diagnostic assessments that are linked to very specific crucial skills, not a full panoply of assessments? I think that would be in many ways depressing for the students, their families, and teachers, but assessments focused on crucial skills and learning to identify where students are, and then focus on a smaller number of those crucial skills and those crucial groups of knowledges. Again, working with all students to bring them together so that they don't feel they're isolated in learning groups and labeled as forever disadvantaged. I think the third crucial issue is not to assume that teachers can make this conversion to online learning simply or quickly. In the United States, we have data that charter schools that were devoted from the beginning to online learning, namely, they were designed for that very purpose, are the worst performing of all of our charter schools. They least well serve children. This lesson from the United States suggests that teaching online involves a completely different set of skills than traditional teaching. For example, attention on the part of children drifts much more quickly. Online teaching requires continual checks for understanding in very active ways. It must engage children much more frequently than in the traditional classroom, even though engagement is always important. It must be intense in the sense that the teacher must always ask herself or himself, in what way are all my children being involved in their own learning? Because the attention spans are short, and without real professional support, professional development, I worry, particularly in times of fiscal stringency, that teachers aren't going to get the required preparation so that they can move more adequately from online to face-to-face to online. Because all of our data here in the States suggests that it isn't going to be as simple as flicking a switch and suddenly having all your children back in a face-to-face environment. Putting all of this together, I think the key is the following. Yes, we have to understand the social and emotional challenges that families and children have been through. We have to accept that we will see children, disadvantaged children, further behind than even ever before. And in the United States, we already have groups that are 2 and 3 years below grade level. But rather than creating any sense of stress or panic, we have to take a deep breath and say, this is an opportunity to focus on key grade level skills, key knowledge, and to work very hard with just-in-time preparation, with scaffolding, with on-ramps, to bring all of our children as much as possible to that level of learning. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for this very thorough sharing of the experience in the United States. I think here again, the tension between the need to accelerate programs and learning and the risk not for children or students who might or are lagging behind because they are in disadvantaged groups, not to catch up. And not to catch up not only for this school year, but for the rest of their school career is very key. And we've seen that in a lot of experience sharing or a lot of situations in country. This tension is key. And also what you pointed out is not only the status, but the efficiency or the way we think in terms of online learning. You know, of course, this has been done, but it could not be applied everywhere, leaving some kids even more lagging behind. And how is it going to be part of the next steps? What should we expect from this online learning, or what shouldn't we expect from it? Probably is also something that needs to be thought out. So thank you for that. I would like now to go in another region and turn to Tara. Tara, you're based in Jordan. The World Bank, one of our partners here, is using an interesting phrase when it comes to the COVID-19 response and that framework. They say, build back better. So as a UNICEF specialist based in Jordan, how do you think the country can build back better based on its experience of before, during, and what's being prepared for after the crisis to improve learning or to catch up with what has been lost? Jane?
Thank you so much. I mean, the comments that all of the colleagues have been making this afternoon really resonate with us here in Jordan, because every single one of them, whether they're around negotiating digital technologies, or how can we support parents more, how do we reconnect, and how do we start with the learners, is all questions that we're actually grappling with. But to keep to the theme of Build Back Better, it is an opportunity. It reminds every single one of us that in the long term, let's look at how we can improve the education system while we actually respond to the emergency response. So my focus on Jordan really is around what the ministry and partners have been doing over the last few months and how they have managed to develop an emerging strategy that will move us towards Build Back Better, building on some of these comments. I mean, just to give you a little context on Jordan, most of you will be aware of the Syrian crisis entering into its 9th consecutive year, and clearly that's affected the school system and the economic circumstances. So thinking about that as we talk about Build Back Better, I think it's important that no country is starting again. We all have plans. In Jordan, we have a well-established education sector plan. And whilst there has been moves to develop an education in emergencies plan, it's been important that the ministry has been able to work with UNESCO and IIEP to actually think through how do we respond to COVID whilst keeping away from distracting ourselves from the plans that we already have, the solid plans that we've put in place. So we face the challenge of balancing our existing planning with planning against emergency. Jordan has made an amazing response to the emergency. The schools closed on the 15th of March, and almost immediately it mobilized its teachers in front of cameras to prepare lessons for the nation's children. The lessons were broadcast, but they were also put in cloud space. Private partnership arrangements allowed for data to be free. And there's plans also to provide free data for teachers. But we all know that providing a form of online learning means children have to be able to access it. And we've found that at least 23% of vulnerable households have no access to any of this. And a further 54% of children haven't accessed the online platforms. So we're already developing an even wider gap. We know for children to learn effectively, they have to do more than listen to television. They need to engage with content. They need to be creative, develop skills in problem solving and critical thinking, whilst we're all still trying to think about how are we going to make up this gap. We're aware of the existing inequalities We're concerned that school closures will increase learning inequality and dropout, particularly for the poorest, refugees and children with disability. And we're very concerned that children in early adolescence linked to child labour and child marriage are, you know, on the point where we could lose more children from the system. So as a donor community, we're also thinking about schools when they reopen. And Rukmini talked about reconnecting. David's talked about children starting where children are at and trying to focus on those things. And I think we've been having the same conversations. But I think in the heart of this conversation is how we program our language. We don't want children to feel they're failing. We don't want them to come from grade 4 to suddenly manage the grade 5 curriculum, when, as David has mentioned, maybe 40% of learning has been lost in the previous year. We're not giving them, and I think this is a really important point, we're not giving them remedial instruction. They've simply lost the opportunity to learn. And I think it's important we level with children and we say to them, look, this has happened and we as educators are going to do our best to accelerate the learning, which is what David's talked about. But accelerating learning isn't easy, and we've got to be really careful that we don't miss key concepts, that we don't build to depth. So those things have to be factored in. We need to look at other options around the edges. Can we use our instructional hours that we have more effectively? What might supplementary work look like for children? And that then brings us straight back to the points again that Rukmini raised around the role of parents and what parents can do. And I think at the heart of all our programming at the moment, we all have to accept that the parents' role has changed, and build back better means we need to work with parents, not to become the teachers of children, but to become people who really believe in themselves that they can add value to their child's education. I think the final points, I'm not going to make many points about teachers because I think that's been covered very well by Tara, and I agree with all the points she's making. And in Jordan, we are grappling with how do we develop teachers' skills in instruction and not pushing them to a point of going online before we've actually built up those instructional skills. And I think to do that, we're very clear that over the coming year, there needs to be systemic change in the way ministers and educators plan for the new school year to respond to the individual needs of learners, alongside the social, political and financial will to support the most vulnerable, where reaching out will be more expensive, and working with our government partners to really advocate for enabling teachers to do so. Over, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. This is very precious also to have this particular experience of a country, Jordan, and a region which we maybe haven't, has been highlighted that much during the crisis, but has also, of course, the schools have closed and have been touched by the situation. I think it's very important what you said about, having a regular education sector plan and then re-engaging or readjusting into an emergency plan. A lot of what we've seen here and which is at stake in school reopening is how do you adjust or adapt or even change a lot from your regular pre-established, whatever you call that, a strategy, your goals, your indicators that you want to reach, your plans, your roadmap, onto something that is fully disruptive. And how do you adjust? How do you plan? How do you prepare for that? Is really key. Second thing also that you pointed out, and many other panelists pointed out, is also the role of parents. It would be interesting to see. They have been fully involved. At some point you said that it was not one of the key points, but interesting, they have been involved. And how do you relate that with what is coming next? I think is also interesting, very interesting point. We have another maybe 5-10 minutes before we go for the Q&A session with the audience. I have a lot of questions to ask to the all the panelists, but I will probably just ask one, so we have really full time to exchange with the audience. I see that there are a lot of questions. So let me ask you, and you maybe for 2-3 minutes response. In a few words, because you said a lot of different things, which are activities, what should be done, what is being prepared, also some kind of principles. But in a few words, what key measure or strategic approach or strategy, whatever you want, would you like to highlight, either in the country you work in and with, or more globally, when it comes to decision made by ministries of education or governments to reopen schools? If you had one or two to really highlight, either principle or maybe a minor kind of key program or activity. Maybe, Jane, I will begin with you and go into the order.
Thank you. I think one of the key things is that we've all got to adapt. And for teachers, particularly in many countries where they're used to having a very textbook-driven curriculum with a lot of curriculum coverage and perhaps even performance by results in some places, is that how do we release them to be able to respond to our learners where they're at? And how do we help them adapt that curriculum to make it manageable in the points that people have been raising? And I think that's going to be our biggest challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. David?
So I think one of the crucial issues is to be ready to teach in many, many forms, particularly in countries with extremely disadvantaged students. I notice questions from Nepal, for example, where there's a real lack of access to online facilities. How are we going to use radio? How are we going to use any smart devices? How are we going to use old-fashioned reading materials, packets? How are we going to manage for schools and students that may span a wide range of background conditions? I think this is a time when public, government, states, province, local education really have to be honest about where their children are in terms of that access, and not plan for some artificial ideal, but plan for the real. The very quick second point, we look at research, my colleague Bob Slavin here at Johns Hopkins, on what is the single most effective way to impact student learning. And that is having tutors, right? Obviously, one-on-one tutoring is incredibly expensive, but small group tutoring, where you really focus on that key learning goal and bring students together who are around the same level of understanding, can make a huge difference. That can be done orally. It doesn't have to use visual internet. It can be done in different ways. It can even be done off-site. And even on weekends, but we have to reach all of our students. That is my key message.
Thank you, David. I will turn to Tara for this kind of, to respond to the same question.
Hi, yes, those were two excellent responses, and I'm thinking about whether I really have anything to add to that. I do want to come back to the focus a bit on teachers and talk a little about building systems to help teachers manage this whole, all these expectations, manage the stress, be able to reach out, if it's to coaches or through WhatsApp groups, moderated WhatsApp groups, to be able to get the kind of help they need so that they can then reach out to students in ways and mechanisms that work best in a given context.
Thank you, Tara. Rukmini?
Very hard to say all the things that are coming into my head, but I'll just reiterate a couple of things. I think we must celebrate. I think everybody needs positive energy. The second thing is there has to be a connection to every child. even if it is a few minutes that the teacher spends with every child in the first week that the school opens, I think reconnecting to every child is really important. The third, which we've all talked about, is give enough room for catch-up. A fourth one, I think, is connect to the community, because this is our chance to make the school and our young people the center of everything that happens in the community. And the fifth one is that we should not pretend that schools will reopen and then they will stay open. There may be some opening and shutting and back and forth. And therefore think about a continuum where some activities can happen at home, some can happen in smaller groups, as David was talking about, maybe in the neighborhood, and then some happen in the school. But all of this continuum is connected. So celebrate, connect, community, catch up, and continuum. And frankly, don't worry about curriculum this year. That will happen. This year, spend the time in building our human connections and the foundations.
Thank you, Rukmini. I think I didn't get all the verbs or names, but it almost the 4 or 5 C's. I think it will rest in our mind. Guangchol, would you please have a word on that before we go to the Q&A session?
Thank you. I would agree with all what other panelists have said. Just a couple of things that I'd like to emphasize is that don't rush, prepare, be gradual. And so it's not only about academic knowledge, but also we have to make sure that teachers and students are ready emotionally, so that there is a social and emotional well-being that can also be providing conducive environment for better learning. Second is that we are talking about learning loss or learning whatever. I think I would say that also this should be kind of assessment of learning, not only from the perspective of learning loss, but of learning experience. How teachers and students, learners, they have experienced this period of social distancing, confinement, and also the aspects of online, TV, whatever learning, so that all these elements, lessons learned, could be used to strengthen our education systems further.
Thank you, Guangchol. We have another 30 minutes or so to go for this webinar. And I would like now to ask our panelists to interact with the audience, not directly, unfortunately, but we will relay some questions. There were a lot of questions posed during the initial part of the webinar. I will now turn to my colleague Yeva, who I think is has grabbed a number of these questions and is going now to ask them to the panelists. So either they will be directly asked, some of you, or you can, to make responses. Yeva, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. So indeed, I hope that you can also hear me well. We have received a lot of very interesting questions on many different themes, and it's true that many of them concern teachers. So I think the first question will be dedicated to Tara, and your colleagues from UNICEF Cambodia wanted to know how, in more practical terms, operationalize teachers' frequent use of digital tools for managing learning systems, especially now in this difficult context when schools remain closed. And what are some ways or measures that can accelerate the technology skills of teachers, and that needs to be done quite quickly given in this context? So Tara, the floor is yours on this question.
Yes, thanks a lot for that question. So there are so there is one way to start off with this, which is to use low sort of technology interfaces such as interactive radio, interactive TV. The important part is that it's interactive. So there are ways in which teachers can call back a number or get onto a WhatsApp group. WhatsApp groups are used quite widely by teachers across the countries that I've worked in. So it's important to just keep the interactive bit going. And it's also important to realize that this is going to be a sort of very basic level of professional development or training that will be made available to teachers if it's going to happen through broadcast, through interactive broadcast. And then once there's an opportunity for face-to-face, then one can build upon this, but at least we get the basic level done. In terms of what kind of technological skills need to be further built in teachers, so there are a number of examples of this. One is, of course, working on the pre-service curriculum more to have elements of how to use simple technologies like Microsoft Teams and things like that, or how to engage students more, how to make, also how to have in-service training that is more blended so that it doesn't just rely on text, but also being able to use technology more creatively instead of just replacing text. So there are a number of these examples. We have some of them in our note on teachers. Then we have a few interesting posts, blog posts, which have articulated these across countries, which I'd be happy to, I'll put the link down in the chat box, and you could look at that. That provides more detail.
Thank you very much for your response. We also received a lot of questions from our participants relating to non-tech-based distance learning strategies, as many of them were raising issues that actually online solutions are not available to a very big population of students, and that we need to find alternative modalities to address this. So a lot of examples have already been mentioned during the different presentations, but are there any other that are worth mentioning when it comes really to ensuring that learning continues for those students that cannot access online materials? And here I invite all panelists to contribute to this response with the specific examples.
So I think there's a real opportunity for an enormous push for volunteer efforts, particularly among students who may have just graduated from high school, maybe in between that and their next stage. We could really mobilize a very large number of young people to help with group learning, to help teachers to reach particular groups of students. For the tutoring that I mentioned earlier, we could imagine a really major investment in supporting younger people who are slightly older than their student peers to assist, because I think asking existing teachers to reach all of the different groups through all of the different modalities is really to put an almost unbearable weight on the shoulders of our teachers. I think we have to understand that if we're going to reach all of our students, we're going to have to use new models of personnel and realize that young people may have a real opportunity to contribute, even at a volunteer level, but even too with some support.
If I can just jump in here, David, during this lockdown period in Pratham in India, we really benefited from this group and this young volunteers helping children.
Right. Yeah.
For most of our programs, we have activity that we do with teachers in the school, but we also have neighborhood groups of children, partly because we wanted in the pre-COVID time to encourage children to do stuff together and without, not all the time with instructional support. Yes. And it's these groups that really have been the backbone of this community connect through the lockdown period. And I want to just, bring in the technology angle, that our first reaction when we were locked down was to say, can we reach at least every community that we were in through whatever kind of phone? Having at least established one anchor within each community, usually a youth volunteer, we then began to see whether we could connect into every neighborhood. Once we were able to connect into every neighborhood, we then began to see if we could reach every child. So we really work in these nested ways. Smartphones are often not accessible or not available to children, even if the father or somebody older has it. So we moved in a big way to SMS. And I have to say that hats off to my colleagues in a 160 character message, how much can you put in that can get children to be engaged? The other thing we noticed that as soon as parents figured out, there have been a lot of questions on the chat about literacy level of parents not being connected. But I think if there are enough anchors into our communities, usually young people, usually sometimes they are older brothers and sisters, then the parents and children figure out ways to communicate back. So we've been sending out phone messages, a large part of them on SMS, some on WhatsApp, but there is also a phone call that goes from somebody the kid knows. And I think it's that, again, the combination of technology and human interaction, a hybrid way of doing it, that has helped in situations where technology has not been there. I want to just leave with one last point, that there is this is an incident from a rural a part of a remote part of rural Western India in Gujarat, where one person would get the message for a little activity for children, and they would write it on little pieces of paper, it's just 2 or 3 lines, and circulate it in the village, or near the tea shop, actually write it down on a blackboard. So that if there is no, at least 1 or 2 people being connected can help a whole community if you have a social structure behind it.
Thank you very much for these very interesting responses. Yes, Jane, would you like to add to this?
Yes, I mean, we've tried similar things. And one of the things we have tried is sending out activities by WhatsApp through WhatsApp Business, so it's automated. And what happens is the activities are written, and they're all very open-ended, and they're written for 6+, 8+, and 10+, and they're sent out every day. And the family actually has to say, yes, we want to receive them. And then we had the difficulty of how do we make a feedback loop for these children, because we're talking about largely children who've been locked down in refugee camps. So they've got very little space, very few resources. And what we've managed to do is have them feedback through Facebook. So they might produce little videos or pictures of what they've done, and then they can begin to share their work. Now that's not totally no technology, but having started with a small amount of technology, we're looking now at how we can take that on with no technology at all, through sharing the activities through facilitators in a similar way that David was mentioning, and looking at how we can again build up parents not to be the instructor, but to at least be able to ask the right questions and set up the habits in the home to allow children to engage.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to add also that it's not only online, means telephone, SMS, but I think we have to also see other medias like radio, TV, because in many of the societies, even in developed countries, there are still pockets of population that cannot have access to online connectivity. So I think we have to mobilize at this stage, also see how radio and TV and other means of communication could be deployed in order to be able to reach out also those population, because in any case in developing, least developing countries, still radio and TV are the most democratic kind of means of reaching out to the population. This can be used also for not only learning, but also campaigns, back to school campaign, sensitization, advocacy. And so UNESCO has been kind of cooperating with media sectors like European Broadcasting Union, Asia Pacific Broadcasting Union, and also Latin America Broadcasting Union, in order to organize some webinars and joint training workshops to be able to, so that teachers and the education community and media community can work together to better leverage, to kind of limited, but limited, although it is limited, but the potential of what this traditional media can bring during this lockdown period.
Thank you very much for these responses. It's really very interesting. We also received a lot of questions that we are linked to the dropout of students, and some of the participants were wondering what strategies can be adopted before the reopening of schools to ensure that all children actually come back to school, which of course is key for them to continue learning. So this question was addressed to Rukmini, but I invite also other participants to contribute to the response on strategies to ensure the children actually come back to schools.
So I think that, if somebody asked me, one of the first things to do when schools open or even before schools open, at least in India, I would focus on the girls in 8th grade. 8th is our last year of elementary school and of compulsory schooling. And it is really recent cohorts where almost everybody who was enrolled 10 years ago, 8 years ago in 1st grade is reaching 8th grade. And it is also the age at which you could be quite useful at home, especially if you're a girl, and your parents may be, especially some of the adult women in the family may need to go out and look for work because of the economic hardship. So I would give my 8th graders, especially the girls, a very important role in the school, so that their presence in the school is almost critical to, maybe something very important in the school, like, we'll have to think about what that could be, so that we notice and we encourage and make sure that not only they're coming to school, but they see their responsibility as part of the school community. I'm also concerned about the children who are going to go to 1st grade this year, because going to 1st grade is also a very exciting event. And we want to make sure that the cohort, that is the 2020 cohort, gets special attention, because they are coming through and coming into school at a very difficult time. And so what can we do in the community that can prepare for this kind of transition into school? And along with every child coming to 1st grade, I think, is the parents, particularly the mothers, who have to be encouraged to make sure that they can come in as well. So it's not like the other children are not important, but I think when you look at the transition points, focus on them, make sure that whether it is girls, whether it is children from maybe the most underprivileged part of the village are at the focus of this, then we can be sure that every child will then be coming in.
If I could just add to what Rukmini said, I think it's so important, especially in these grades, and I would also take in 3rd grade, because I think a lot of students begin to drop out then in a number of the countries that I've been working in, is to have teachers create an environment which is welcoming, which is friendly, stress-free, and which is not being overtly obsessed with learning at that point. I think that's going to be very important, and teachers need help with doing that because they have so many other pressures. They know that they're going to be very soon asked about the curriculum. So to support teachers in just creating that kind of easy environment, and here I think school leaders are going to have an important role to play, school principals, and we need to be able to encourage that more.
I think in the States, we have a particular concern with boys. Our boys, particularly of color, but all across the spectrum, are performing well below girls. And in particular, at the high school level, my particular concern in a place like Baltimore or St. Louis or any of our challenged inner city communities is that having been disconnected from learning, particularly adolescent boys, may be at particular risk of remaining disconnected. We're going to have a situation in which some of the ways of reaching them, for example, through sporting activities, may not be available when schools come back. A lot of those club, social, and belonging events may not be possible. And so we're going to have to make a special effort in the communities not to let those young men fall through the cracks. Women too, of course, but we have this disproportionate amount of engagement already built into our inner city and our rural experiences. I think the crucial point is for teachers and schools and school districts not to turn a blind eye. Every one of those children is our child, and every one of those children needs to be reached educationally, even if their parents take the decision that for physical health reasons, they don't want that child physically back in school. That's why planning for reality, that reality, is so crucial, and it has to happen now, not 3 days before school reopens.
Thank you very much. We also received a question about early childhood education. As we know, youngest children might be the most exposed to different unwelcoming conditions outside the school. And we have this question wanting to know whether there are any specific measures or any specific strategies that we should consider for reopening early childhood education facilities. So I invite all panelists to contribute to the response.
Particular early childhood is a great favorite of us here at Pratham, so I felt I had to say something. I think encouraging early childhood centers, which are, at least in India, largely community-based, right in your neighborhood, provides an opportunity for actually people in the neighborhood to help that center start up quickly. We've had a very good experience with mothers groups. So if there is an early childhood center and children come from a couple of neighborhoods, having mothers groups with a couple of lead mothers who in any case can help with the opening and the smooth running of the early childhood center, I think is the way to go. I believe that the long run sustainable solution, especially in countries like ours where school systems or early childhood systems continue to need help, is to invest heavily in mothers of younger children and use this opportunity right now to say, when we open, come back and come with your child. Because even if it's for a short period of time a day, it will help to bring strength back into the early childhood system.
I'd like to say a few words because the question also is that there is a kind of lack of knowledge or evidence on what's happening when it comes to early childhood food education and care, which is very much true. And also knowing that early childhood preschool education is very much different in the design and governance across countries, very much sometimes private sector initiative. So we, knowing that also this Asia cohort is very important for future learning, I think there is need to do more to build knowledge and evidence in that particular age cohort, especially also knowing that, in whatever during and afterwards, this age is critically important for future learning. So I think there are some initiatives that are taking place, including surveys that are being organized, supported by UNESCO, UNICEF, and others to have some more, to build some more knowledge, to build some more evidence. And also the survey that I refer to my presentation covers some information about what's happening at preschool level, preschool and early childhood education level. So this can be shared also after the webinar through the analysis of what we have collected from countries.
I think we are looking at places like our own university school, Henderson Hopkins, to think again about the use of the school building, school space, and school time. What I mean by that is to think not just of school as a place for grade level classrooms, but open it up for the community. Create activities, including providing support for mothers, for parents, in out of hours open space, weekends, evenings, early morning, even during the day where you have space. We have to rethink the use of the school building as a community entity that is open and inviting, and doesn't just say you're here for your child's formal education, that this is an educating space, a supportive space, a community space in which parents are welcome, in which there's support available for those early childhood learning skills. I think if we just throw this back to the community and say, just do it, I think we're being irresponsible.
I just wanted to maybe spend a few seconds on a new initiative at the World Bank, along with the support of the Global Partnership for Education. It's called Read at Home. And the goal is to be able to get small, very reader-friendly storybooks in the hands of children at home. And the mechanism is going to vary across countries. In the country that I am based in right now, in Laos, we're going to work through child community development groups, so through caregivers, to be able to reach these storybooks to children. Many of these children don't have any kind of print at home. And what these storybooks do, they are nice, brightly colored children's books. You learn how to hold a book. You learn what is the right way to turn the pages in that particular language. And you get familiar with print, which is at least a start in case your parents don't have the time or are not able to read to you. So this is something that we've started on, and we're hoping we'll be able to expand and work on and improve in the following months.
Thank you very much. So I guess we are approaching the end of the Q&A session. So maybe just the last very short question, linking also to the responses that we've just heard, would be on the supports to families, because it has been noted multiple times during the webinar, this webinar, that families and parents are at the center of the situation, and they are very, very important. And maybe you have any concluding remarks on the best support to families before schools reopen.
I think it's always a tricky one working with families, because certainly from the school side, we often feel that there's a missing part between what you're trying to teach and whether families get involved, they're teaching children in the right way, and it's confusing. But I think it's actually crucial that we do more on involving parents, because they're with their children all the time, be accepting the situation now is different from before. We've asked the world to teach their own children, and it will be quite interesting to see if that will also lead to a better perception of teachers. I'm sure there's many, many people who've said how difficult this was and pay teachers more. And maybe that's a message that will allow us to work more with teachers, whilst at the same time saying that this is a collaborative space and that parents bring a lot to their children. And even, you know, people talk about, well, if the parents are illiterate, does that mean the children are significantly disadvantaged? There are so many things they can do with their children. They can develop the right habits, they can ask the right questions, they can be enthusiastic, they can take interest. And I've been looking recently at thinking about, we've got quite a lot of parenting programs around that we all use. Do those parenting programs have enough content around supporting your child learning? And are the parenting programs reaching higher up the system to adolescents as well? And maybe that's a place where we can really develop the work going forward.
Yeah, just quickly, so what kind of support to provide to parents or families? I think this is a kind of a multi-dimensional question. There are many things that should be done for parents, social, pedagogical, whatever. But we all know also that things are very different across countries and regions. And even though in better off countries, parents, they are not, even they are literate, but they have all this. They have a really, I mean, we have gone through exciting experience of interacting with the children, with also having to try to provide some education to the children and so on, while at the same time they are also illiterate parents who cannot do much. But I think there are many exciting experiences that we have collected during this lockdown, school closures, countries broadcasting radio, TV, or online kind of educational programs that also promote intergenerational and family learning. So parents and children, they have the opportunity to learn together, to enjoy while watching educational programs, which are also, promoting kind of exciting learning experiences. So I think all these experiences could be better harnessed in order to see how now education and learning could be better, featured, framed and featured in the future.
I wanted to just say that we keep talking about learning loss, but I also think that this period has been a time of learning gain. If you think about learning for school and very academic things, perhaps there will have been some loss there. But I think that probably every family and every child has gained a lot and learned new things. And so, how do we capture this learning for life, which has actually enhanced, some of our capabilities. Second point is that while I think parents are very important, I'm a grandparent, so I'd like to make a plug that there are other people in the family. And very often it's siblings and grandparents who actually have a little bit more time sometimes than the parents of young children. And even if you're illiterate, even if you can't read, I think there is one unifying feature I'd like to think that, cuts across everyone, which is there are stories. You can either read stories like Tara has been describing or read at home, but you can tell stories and you can hear stories. And therefore, I think that, using the resources that families have, not just parents, but the entire family, to say, here is what we can do with our kids. And if nothing else, we can tell you stories and you can listen to our stories and we can make up stories.
Thank you very much. So I think that this is the end of the Q&A session, and thank you very much for all of your interesting questions and very insightful responses. And now I turn to Uk for closing remarks.
Thank you, Eva. Thank you all for these responses. We only have 2-3 minutes left, so I'm definitely not going to grasp and summarize and analyze everything you've said. It would really be too much. But considering the breadth of the topic, I think we covered a number of issues. Are pending questions that still need to be experience sharing, but also research, perspective, solutions were offered. And I think all of this is very, very precious. So I would like to thank you all, Runara, Jane, David, for having participated. I would like my colleagues from the headquarters, beginning with Gwen Scholl, who was a panelist, Sue Grant-Lewis, Director of IEP, Yeva, thank you. Thanks to all the colleagues from UNICEF-World Band who also participated in organizing this webinar. Two things to finish with. First of all, a brief article to summarize and provide some information on the content of this web will be online either tonight or tomorrow morning. You can catch up with the webinar. So I'm not sure where you can to be on the chat, but you will definitely find that on the webpage of UNESCO on this series of webinar. It's joint UNESCO-UNICEF-World Bank webinar series. Rio, and find that. So that's the first. Second point to finish. The next webinar Now in 2 days, it will be on June 10th on school same operation, and it will be led by UNICEF. And then you can find the whole series of days of these webinars on the same web page I just told you about. And the next one are June 15th, 24th, 29th. The next webinar is in 2 days on June 10th. Thank you very much above all to all the, still have around 400 people. At some point we are close to 500 people. So thank you all. We were delighted to work at the webinar and to discuss with the panelists and with you. And hopefully we'll be online all together in today for the next webinar on the series. So much, and we will be in touch. Bye.
Bye-bye.